The mare was bleeding, not a fresh wound, but the old kind, the kind that crusts over with dirt and sun and the silence of a long, hard road. She limped in a tight, desperate circle, her ribs pushing against her hide like broken planks on a shipwreck. She was a ghost of a horse, barely there at all, and tied to her with a rope thin enough to be an insult was a girl. She sat in the dust, barefoot, silent. A dirty strip of cloth was tied tight around her eyes. The market in Smoke Gulch was pure chaos. The air smelled of sweat, manure, and cheap whiskey. Men shouted prices, cattle groaned in their pens, and the whole world felt like it was simmering under the Montana sun. But one man stood apart from it all. His name was Ezekiel Boone. He was a giant of a man, built like the barn doors he made with his own 2 hands. At 6'6", he cast a long, sharp shadow from beneath the feed store awning. He wasn't there to buy cattle. He wasn't there to trade stories. He was just watching. The man selling the horse and the girl was a mess. Red-faced, sweating liquor, his voice a ragged saw cutting through the noise. He yanked on the rope, making the mare stumble. "Final offer!" he bellowed. "The mare's lame, yeah, but she can still throw a foal. And the girl, well, she's quiet, won't give you no trouble." He spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near the girl's bare feet. She didn't even flinch. "Blind, mute, dumb as a post," the seller crowed. $5 for the pair. Hell of a deal." A ripple of ugly laughter went through the crowd. Some men looked away in disgust. Others grinned, nudging each other. It was just another piece of livestock, another broken thing to be bought and sold. But Ezekiel Boone stepped out of the shadows. His boots made a single, heavy sound on the dry earth. The noise of the market seemed to fall away. Every eye turned to him. His voice was low and flat as a cooled iron skillet. "The girl is for sale too?" The sweaty seller squinted up at the mountain of a man before him. A greasy smile split his face. "Hell yeah, she is. She was my wife's, I think. Can't talk, can't see, but she cleans like you wouldn't believe. Don't say a damn word. It's like owning a ghost that does chores." More laughter. Vile, careless. Ezekiel stepped closer. Now he could see the girl properly. She was younger than he thought. Maybe 20, maybe less. Her skin was pale under the grime, her lips cracked and dry. But there was something else. Something wrong. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't crying. In the face of all this cruelty, she was perfectly, unnaturally still. It wasn't the stillness of fear. It was the stillness of waiting. "What's her name?" Ezekiel asked. The seller scoffed. "Don't got one. I just holler, 'Hey,' and she moves. Seems to be all she needs." Ezekiel's eyes dropped to the rope tied loosely around her wrist. It wasn't meant to restrain. It was for show. Then his gaze fell to her bare feet. Just then, a horse in a nearby pen snorted loudly, and the girl's big toe twitched. Just once. A tiny, almost invisible movement in the dust. It wasn't a random spasm. It was a reaction. She'd heard it. She knew exactly where it came from. Ezekiel didn't say a word. He reached into his coat, his huge hand pulling out a small, worn roll of cash. He peeled off a few bills and held them out. It was far more than $5. "Take it," he said. The seller's eyes went wide. He snatched the money without even counting it, his grin showing a row of broken yellow teeth. "Pleasure doing business with you, friend. Don't say I didn't warn you, though. There's something odd about that one. Gives me the chills." Ezekiel ignored him completely. He crouched down, his huge frame making him seem even larger next to the small, still girl. His rough fingers, surprisingly gentle, worked at the knot on her wrist. She flinched. Not from fear. It was a tiny, sharp intake of breath, as if the gentleness itself was a shock to her system. The rope fell away. He said nothing to her. He just gave a low click of his tongue to the mare. The wounded horse, as if recognizing a different kind of authority, limped after him. Then, Ezekiel gave a single, short nod in the girl's direction. She stood up, and she followed. As they walked away from the market, leaving the noise and the cruelty behind, the girl did something Ezekiel would never forget. A large, jagged rock lay directly in her path. a rock that would have cut her bare foot open. Without looking down, without breaking her stride, she sidestepped it perfectly. Ezekiel saw it. He filed it away, that little piece of the puzzle. But still he said nothing. He just kept walking, the broken horse and the silent girl trailing behind him like a secret he'd just bought for a handful of dollars. The walk back to the Boone Ranch was long. The Montana sky was a vast, empty canvas, bleeding orange at the edges. Ezekiel walked in front, the mare's reins held loosely in one hand. The mare limped. The girl walked. Neither made a sound. It was a strange little parade of broken things, heading into the dusk. When they finally reached his property, shadows were stretching like long, cool fingers across the land. The air smelled of pine and dry hay. He opened the gate and led the mare into the stable, the familiar scent of cedar and old leather greeting them. The girl stopped right at the doorway. She just stood there, hands at her sides, waiting, like a soldier waiting for an order. Ezekiel looked back at her. Her face was tilted up, but the blindfold hid her expression. He gave another one of his quiet nods. She walked in. No stumbling, no hesitation. She crossed the uneven floor of the barn as if she'd walked it 100 times before. Inside, he lit an oil lamp. As the flame caught and flared, casting dancing golden shadows on the walls, he saw her head tilt. Just for a fraction of a second. She'd sensed the change in light, even through the cloth. Something was definitely not right. He moved slowly, deliberately. He tore a chunk of bread from a loaf he kept on a shelf and placed it on a small, dusty table. "Sit," he said. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet barn. She sat. No fumbling for the chair. Her hands rested in her lap, her back ramrod straight. She wasn't just sitting. She was holding a position. Ezekiel Boone was a man of few words, but his mind was racing. He looked at the pale, dirt-streaked face, the still hands, the blindfold that was supposed to mean she was helpless. He'd seen men lie with their words. He'd seen them lie with their eyes. He had never seen someone lie with their entire body like this. He pulled up a stool and sat across from her. The lantern light flickered between them. "You're not blind," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. For the first time since he'd seen her, the girl's stillness broke. A tiny muscle in her throat moved as she swallowed. It was the smallest of movements, but it was enough. It was a confession. She knew that he knew. The old barn groaned around them as the wind picked up outside. The mare sighed softly in her stall, settling into the fresh straw Ezekiel had laid out. The air was thick with unspoken things. He didn't push. He just watched her, his gaze steady and patient. "You didn't stumble once," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Not on the road from town, not on the trail. You stepped over that rock at the market, the one that would have torn your foot open. You turned your head when the lamp flared." He leaned forward, just an inch. The intensity in his eyes was like a physical weight. "You're not blind," he repeated, "and I'm willing to bet you're not mute either." The silence stretched on, tight as a wire. This wasn't the dead silence of the market. This was a living silence, the kind that comes before a lightning strike. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Then, slowly, deliberately, the girl lifted her hands to her face. Her fingers, though smudged with dirt, moved with a strange, practiced grace. She found the knot at the back of her head and began to untie the blindfold. She was unwrapping a secret. The dirty cloth fell into her lap with a sound no louder than a sigh, and she lifted her head. Her eyes were the color of dark, rich earth. They weren't just clear of injury, they were clear of fear. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, endured too much, and had come out the other side made of something harder than steel. They met his gaze and held it. "My name," she said, her voice raspy from disuse but steady, "is Clara Estrella." Ezekiel just stared. He had bought a ghost, a broken thing, but the woman sitting in front of him was no ghost. She was fire and iron, hidden under layers of dust and silence. "And no," she added, her voice gaining a little more strength. "I'm not blind. I was pretending." He didn't have to ask the question. He could see 100 terrible reasons in her steady gaze. But she told him anyway. Her hands clenched in her lap, the only sign of the storm raging inside her. "If they knew I could see... If they knew I could talk..." Her voice broke for a second, not with sadness, but with the sharp-edged memory of something awful. The blindfold. It kept them away. It made them think I was worthless, useless. She glanced toward the stall where the mare rested. I cared for her. When he forgot to feed her, I did. She was the only reason I didn't run, but then he decided to sell her, and he tied me to her like a piece of luggage. Her jaw tightened, a flicker of pure rage in her dark eyes. He told me no one would ever want a broken girl. He said I was nothing. She looked straight at Ezekiel, her gaze unflinching, and he was right. No one ever did. A beat of silence. Until today. Ezekiel Boone, a man who built walls around himself as surely as he built them around his ranch, felt something inside him shift. A hinge, rusted shut for years, creaked open. "You're not broken," he said. The words felt strange in his mouth, but true. Clara's eyes widened slightly. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he replied. The tension in the air didn't disappear, but it changed. It was no longer a wall between them. It was the space where a wall used to be. Clara sat up a little taller, the exhaustion in her posture replaced by a fragile kind of strength. "I wasn't always like this," she said softly. "I used to talk, I used to laugh. I learned to survive by disappearing. One sense at a time. They take pieces from you, men like him, until you just start handing them over, hoping they'll leave you with enough to live." Her words weren't a complaint. They were a weather report from a hurricane she had lived through. Without another word, Ezekiel stood up. He walked over to a cabinet against the stable wall, pulled out a thick, folded wool blanket, and laid it on the table beside her. "You'll sleep in the barn tonight," he said gruffly. "There's a cot back behind the feed room. I'll clear out the spare room in the house tomorrow." Clara didn't touch the blanket. She just stared at it. "You're not afraid I'm lying about everything else?" A ghost of a smile touched Ezekiel's lips. "If you were still a liar, you'd still be wearing that blindfold." His logic was simple and sharp as a blade. She finally reached out, her fingers touching the rough wool of the blanket. It was the first soft thing she had felt in a long, long time. "You don't want to know more?" she whispered. "I'll know what I need to when you're ready to tell me," he said. She nodded slowly, a single, shaky gesture. She pulled the blanket into her lap, her shoulders loosening for the first time. The rigid soldier was gone, replaced by a weary traveler who had finally found a safe place to rest. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. Ezekiel just gave another short nod. He lit a second lantern and led her to the small room behind the stacks of feed. It was just a space, really. A dusty cot, a windowless room, an old trunk in the corner. But to Clara, it was a fortress. He hung the lantern on a nail by the door. "You'll be safe here," he said. It wasn't a platitude. It was a promise. Then he turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the golden light. Clara stood there for a long moment. She looked at the solid door. She listened to the gentle sounds of the mare settling in the next room. She smelled the clean scent of hay and old wood. That night, lying on the cot with the wool blanket pulled up to her chin, Clara Estrella didn't dream of chains or blindfolds or angry voices. For the first time in years, she didn't dream at all. Meanwhile, in the main house, Ezekiel sat by his cold fireplace, holding a knife he didn't need to sharpen. He just ran the stone along the blade back and forth, listening to the rhythm of it. He didn't like people. He didn't trust them. His life was a fortress of his own making, built of solitude and hard work. But the girl in his barn, she wasn't like other people. Her stillness wasn't weakness. It was a shield. Her silence wasn't emptiness. It was a weapon. He glanced out the window toward the barn, where a faint, warm light still glowed through the cracks in the wood. He had no idea what kind of trouble he had just bought for a few dollars. He didn't know who she was running from, or why. But as he sat there in the dark, Ezekiel Boone knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had stopped running, and he wasn't about to let anyone make her start again. Dawn broke softly over the ranch, painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and pale rose. Ezekiel was already up. He always was. He stood on his porch, a mug of black coffee warming his hands, and watched the mist curl up from the fields. It was his daily ritual, his moment of peace before the world started making its demands. But this morning, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. He could hear small sounds coming from the barn, the scrape of a broom on wood, the soft rustle of straw. It was Clara. She was awake, and she was working, trying to make herself useful, trying to earn her place. He didn't go to her. He gave her space. Instead, he started his own chores, walking the fence line, his boots leaving dark prints in the dew-kissed grass. He checked the feed, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. It was a habit ingrained in him since childhood. Always be prepared. But his thoughts kept circling back to the girl, to her eyes, to the way she'd said her own name, as if reclaiming it from a long, dark place. She hadn't cried. She hadn't begged. She had simply stood her ground after years of pretending she couldn't. And she had stayed. In a world where everyone eventually left, she had stayed. When he finally walked back to the barn, the sun was higher in the sky. He found her brushing the injured mare. Her hair, the color of a raven's wing, was tied back with a piece of twine she must have found. Her movements were slow, gentle, and sure. The mare, who flinched at every loud noise, leaned into her touch, her eyes half closed in a state of pure trust. "You slept," he said from the doorway. It was a statement, not a question. She turned, a hint of a smile on her face. "Better than I have in a very long time." He nodded, the gesture curt but not unkind. "You hungry?" "I can cook," she offered immediately, her voice still a little hoarse. "I'll handle it today," he said, handing her a tin pail. "Fill this at the well." She took it without a word and walked out into the cool morning air. He watched her go. She moved with a quiet grace, her bare feet seeming to know the earth beneath them. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a survivor. At the well, she worked the crank with steady, practiced motions. As the bucket came up, brimming with clear, cold water, she saw her reflection. A stranger looked back at her. A girl with tired eyes, yes, but they were her eyes. Her face, smudged with dirt, was her own. She wasn't the blind, mute ghost from the market anymore. She was just Clara. She carried the water back and found Ezekiel saddling his big bay horse. "I'm heading into town for supplies," he said, not looking at her. He gestured with his chin toward a shed on the other side of the yard. "If you want to keep busy, you can clean up the tools in there. They're a mess." It wasn't a request. It was an offering, a task, a purpose. Clara nodded and walked to the shed. The door creaked open into a world of shadows and dust motes dancing in the slanted light. Tools were scattered everywhere, rusted and disorganized. She picked up a clean rag he'd left for her and began to work. She didn't just wipe them down. She organized them. Hammers with hammers, wrenches with wrenches, everything laid out in neat, perfect rows. There was a deep, satisfying comfort in creating order out of chaos. It was something she could control. She was so focused, she didn't hear him come back. He was just suddenly there, standing in the doorway, blocking the light. "You work like you've done it before," he observed. She didn't turn around. "I've cleaned a lot of places I wasn't allowed to live in." The words were stark and simple, holding a world of pain. He stepped inside, and the small shed suddenly felt tiny. His presence was immense. "You don't have to prove anything here, Clara." "I'm not trying to," she said, finally meeting his eyes. I don't know how to be a burden. A flicker of something, understanding, maybe even empathy, crossed his rugged face. You're not, he said simply. He mounted his horse and, with a final searching look at her, rode off down the long dirt road toward town. Clara spent the rest of the day in a quiet rhythm of work. She mucked out the stalls. She swept the porch of the main house. She washed the few dishes left in the sink until they shone. With every task completed, she felt a piece of herself solidifying. The ghost was fading, and a real person was taking its place. By late afternoon, dark clouds began to gather in the west, and the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Ezekiel returned, his saddlebags bulging with supplies. He found her on the porch, watching the approaching storm. You cook? He asked, his voice rough from the ride. Yes. Then come on. The kitchen was as simple and stark as the rest of the house. A stone stove, a wooden table, 2 chairs. He dropped a sack on the table. Potatoes, carrots, a slab of salt pork, an onion. This is what I got, he said. Clara didn't need any more instruction. She moved around the small kitchen with an efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. Her knife was a blur as she chopped the vegetables. The scent of onions and pork soon filled the small space, a warm, comforting aroma that pushed back against the gloom of the storm outside. Ezekiel watched her from the doorway, his arms crossed over his massive chest. You didn't ask if you could use my stove. She didn't miss a beat. I figured if I made a mess you'd tell me. A rare, almost smile touched his lips. If you leave it cleaner than you found it, you can use it whenever you want. They ate in silence as the first drops of rain began to patter against the window panes. The soup was thick and hot, the best thing Ezekiel had tasted in years. Clara ate slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every single bite. Why do you cook so well? He asked, his curiosity finally getting the better of him. She looked up from her bowl, her dark eyes meeting his. Because when I was learning, if I cooked badly, I didn't eat. His jaw tightened. The simple statement painted a picture more vivid and brutal than any long story could. She saw the anger in his eyes and tilted her head. And you? Why do you live all the way out here, all alone? He hesitated, the question hitting a place he kept walled off. Because, he finally said, his voice low, no one ever had a good reason to stay. Clara put her spoon down. Maybe, she said softly, they just weren't given one. There was no accusation in her voice, just a quiet, simple truth, a truth that hit him harder than a physical blow. He leaned back, studying her, seeing not just the girl he'd rescued, but a woman with a spine of iron and a wisdom forged in fire. When the meal was over, she cleared the table and cleaned the kitchen without being asked. Ezekiel stood in the doorway, the flickering lamplight casting his shadow long behind him. The room next to the kitchen, he said, his back still to her. It's yours. There are some clean clothes in the trunk. See what fits. He didn't wait for a reply. He just stepped out onto the covered porch, into the cool, rain-washed air. Clara stood alone in the warm, quiet kitchen. She ran her hand along the back of a chair, feeling the smooth, solid wood. There was no lock on her new bedroom door, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she realized she didn't need one. But as she lay in her new bed, listening to the storm rage outside, a cold thought crept into her mind. She was safe from the men she knew. But what about the ones she didn't? What if her past wasn't done with her yet? What if it was riding on the back of this very storm, heading right for them? The cellar door was swollen with damp and hadn't been opened in a year. It groaned in protest as Ezekiel hauled it open, the sound echoing in the pre-dawn stillness. The air that rose up was cool and smelled of packed earth and forgotten things. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was just looking for a blanket. A cold snap had come in with the rain, and he'd seen Clara shivering by the fire the night before, though she never would have said a word. He was heading down to the dusty shelves where his mother used to store the winter woolens. He took a lantern, its yellow glow pushing back the shadows as he descended the creaking wooden steps. Crates of old tools, jars of things long spoiled, stacks of wood. He found the blankets tucked under a stiff canvas tarp, just where he remembered them. As he pulled a thick gray wool blanket free, his hand brushed against something hard and metallic. A small tin box. It was rusted at the edges, half hidden under an old coil of rope. Someone had wanted it to be forgotten. He almost left it. His business was with the living, not the dead. But something made him pause. A flicker of intuition. The same instinct that had made him look closer at the silent girl in the market. He set the blanket down, crouched, and pried the box open. The lid let out a painful screech. Inside, resting on faded velvet, were three things. A tarnished brass medal, heavy and smooth, with no inscription. A lock of dark hair tied with a faded blue ribbon, the kind a little girl would wear. And at the very bottom, folded into a tight, tiny square, was a piece of paper. A letter. The ink was faded, the handwriting hurried and desperate, but the words were still terrifyingly clear. To whoever finds this girl, Clara Estrella. She does not belong to you. She belongs to no one. Do not sell her. Do not trade her. Do not think you can own her. She is not running from a cruel stepfather. She is running from something far, far worse. From us. If you try to keep her, we will know. If you go to the law, we will know. We have eyes everywhere. Let her go, or we will come for her. And we will take you, too. This is your only warning. It wasn't signed. Ezekiel's blood ran cold. This wasn't a plea for help from a loving sister. This was a threat. A claim of ownership. From us. Who was us? He stood there in the damp, cold cellar, the letter in his hand, the world tilting on its axis. The girl upstairs wasn't just an escapee. She was prey. And by bringing her here, he had just painted a target on his own back. He folded the letter, his movements stiff, and tucked it deep into his coat pocket. He grabbed the blanket and ascended the stairs, closing the cellar door behind him as if he could trap the chilling discovery in the dark. The morning was gray and bleak. The rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low and heavy, smothering the sky. He found Clara in the barn, humming a soft, tuneless melody as she brushed the mare. She looked peaceful. For a moment, he hated that he was about to destroy that peace. She turned as he approached, a small, genuine smile lighting up her face. But the smile vanished the second she saw his expression. It was as hard and cold as the Montana winter. He walked into the barn, the smell of hay and horses doing nothing to calm the storm inside him. He pulled the folded letter from his coat and held it out for her to see. "What is this?" he asked. His voice was flat, devoid of all warmth. Clara's breath hitched, all the color drained from her face. She looked at the paper as if it were a snake. Where did you find that?" "In a tin box, buried in my cellar." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "Who wrote it, Clara? Who is us?" Her eyes darted to the floor. The strength, the fire he'd seen in her was gone, replaced by a deep, familiar terror. I don't know," she whispered. "Don't lie to me," he growled, his patience gone. "Not now. I found a lock of hair in that box. A child's. Who was she?" Tears welled in Clara's eyes. "My sister," she choked out. "Anna. She was younger than me." Ezekiel's face didn't soften. "What happened to her?" "They took her," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "The man my stepfather sold me to. He wasn't just one man. It was a group. They buy things, horses, land, people. My stepfather was in debt to them. He gave them Anna first, as a down payment." The barn was silent, save for the sound of Clara's ragged breathing. The horror of her words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "He promised me they wouldn't take me if I was worthless," she continued, her voice hollow. "If I was blind and mute, broken. So I pretended, for years. But then the debt got worse, and he broke his promise." She looked up at him, her face a mask of agony. "My real sister. She helped me escape before they could come for me. She's the one who hid that box in your cellar years ago. She worked for your mother once. She knew this place was safe. She told me to run here if I ever got free." Ezekiel felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He had thought he was saving her from one man, a drunk, pathetic bully, but this was an organization, a sickness. "This letter," he said, his voice now dangerously quiet. "This isn't from your sister, is it? It's from them. It's a warning to anyone who might help you." Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "They leave them sometimes, to scare people off, to make sure their property is returned." Property. The word made Ezekiel's hand clench into a fist. He stared at the terrified woman in front of him. He could tell her to leave. He could send her on her way, wash his hands of this whole nightmare, and go back to his quiet, solitary life. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But as he looked at her, trembling but not broken, he saw the ghost of a little girl with a blue ribbon in her hair. He saw the evil that festered just beneath the surface of the world. And Ezekiel Boone, a man who had spent his entire life avoiding trouble, knew that trouble had finally found him, and he wasn't going to back down. He took the letter from his coat. Clara flinched, thinking he was going to give it back to her, to cast her out with it. Instead, he walked over to the small forge he kept in the corner of the barn. With a few quick movements, he struck a flint and lit the kindling. A small flame flickered to life. He held the letter over the fire. "Ezekiel, no!" Clara cried out, lunging forward. "They'll know! They'll—" "Let them," he said, his voice a low growl. He didn't look at her. He watched the paper curl, turn black, and disappear into ash. The threat was gone, consumed by the flames. He turned to face her, his eyes burning with a righteous fury she had never seen before. "This ranch is my land," he said, each word a stone being laid for a foundation. "You are under my protection. If they want you, they have to come through me." Clara stared at him, speechless. She had spent her life running, hiding, making herself small. She had never, not once, had anyone stand in front of her. "Why?" she whispered. "You could be killed." He took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. "There are things worse than dying, Clara," he said, his voice softer now. "And letting men like that win is one of them. Now, we prepare for a storm." A new kind of silence fell between them. Not of fear, but of resolve. The game had changed. This was no longer about hiding. It was about fighting back. And as Clara looked at the giant of a man standing before her, she felt something she hadn't felt in a decade. Hope. It was terrifying, and it was glorious. The news came from Smoke Gulch like a foul wind. It was delivered by Elias Ramirez, the old man who sat on the saloon porch and watched the world go by. He'd ridden his sway-backed mule all the way out to the Boone Ranch, a thing he hadn't done in 10 years. Ezekiel met him at the gate. "Elias, what is it?" The old man's face was grim. "Strangers in town, Ezekiel. 2 of them. Arrived on the midday stage. They ain't ranchers." "What do they look like?" Ezekiel asked, his body going tense. "Fancy. City clothes, polished boots. One is tall and thin like a starved wolf. The other, he's got dead eyes. Cold as a snake's. They're not buying supplies. They're asking questions." The blood drained from Ezekiel's face. "What kind of questions?" Elias spat on the ground. "They're asking about you, son, and they're asking about a girl." The world seemed to stop. The wind in the pines, the call of a distant hawk. It all went silent. They were here. The us from the letter. They had come. "They mentioned a name," Elias continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Said they were looking for property that belonged to a Mr. Morel." Carlos Morel. The name Clara had whispered in terror. "Thanks, Elias," Ezekiel said, his voice strained. "You shouldn't have risked coming out here." "Your father was my friend," the old man said, turning his mule around. "He'd have done the same for me. You be careful, Ezekiel. These men, they smell like death." Elias rode off, leaving Ezekiel standing alone at the gate, the weight of the world on his broad shoulders. He turned and walked back toward the house, his mind a whirlwind. Clara was in the kitchen, kneading dough for bread. Her hands were covered in flour, and for a moment, she looked so normal, so at peace. He hated what he had to tell her. She saw his face and her hands stilled. "What is it?" "They're in town," he said simply. "Two men, asking for you. They mentioned the name Mare." The dough she was holding slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. The peaceful kitchen suddenly felt like a cage. "Two of them?" she whispered, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. One tall and thin, one with cold eyes. She sank into a chair, her face as white as the flour on her hands. "It's him," she breathed. "Carlos Mare. And the other one, that must be Silas, his enforcer. He's the one who took Anna." The name Silas hung in the air like a curse. Ezekiel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted to smash something. He wanted to ride into town and tear them apart with his bare hands. But he knew that's what they wanted. They wanted him to be reckless. "We have to run," Clara said, her voice shaking. "We can leave now, head north." "No," Ezekiel said, his voice a low, firm rumble. "I told you, no more running. This is my land. We fight them here." "We can't win!" she cried, the desperation she'd held back for so long finally breaking through. "You don't know them, Ezekiel. They're monsters. They have money. They have influence. They'll come with the law on their side." "Then we'll be ready for them," he said. He walked over to a heavy wooden chest in the corner of the room, one he hadn't opened in years. He lifted the lid, revealing what was inside: his father's rifle, oiled and gleaming, and beside it, a heavy pistol and several boxes of ammunition. Clara stared at the weapons, horrified. "You're going to kill them?" "I'm going to defend my home," he corrected her. "There's a difference." He began checking the rifle, his movements precise and methodical. The man who tamed horses and built barns was gone. In his place was a warrior. "You said your sister worked for my mother," he said, not looking up from the gun. "What was her name?" "Lillian," Clara whispered. "Her name was Lillian. She told me your father was a lawman once, before he settled here." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "He was. A U.S. Marshal. He quit because he saw too much corruption. He said the law didn't always protect the innocent." He finally looked at Clara, his eyes dark and serious. "He taught me that sometimes a man has to make his own justice." He spent the rest of the day preparing. He barred the windows. He brought the horses into the main barn, closer to the house. He loaded the guns and placed them strategically, one by the front door, one in the loft of the barn. Clara watched him, a storm of fear and awe churning inside her. This man, this quiet giant, was willing to stand against the demons of her past. He was willing to die for her. As dusk began to settle, casting long, eerie shadows across the yard, they saw it. Two riders, silhouetted against the blood-red sunset. They were coming. They didn't ride fast. They approached the ranch with a slow, arrogant confidence, as if they already owned the place. They stopped just outside the main gate, two dark figures in the fading light. Ezekiel stood on the porch, his father's rifle held loosely in his hands. Clara stood in the doorway behind him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. One of the men dismounted. It was the tall, thin one, Carlos Mare. He walked to the gate, his movements smooth and predatory. "Ezekiel Boone!" he called out, his voice carrying in the still air. It was cultured, polite, and utterly chilling. "My name is Carlos Mare. I believe you have something that belongs to me." "There's nothing here for you," Ezekiel called back, his voice a low growl. Mare chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Oh, I think there is. A piece of property. Her name is Clara. I have a bill of sale, all perfectly legal. Now you can hand her over peacefully, and we'll be on our way. No trouble." "She's not property," Ezekiel said, raising the rifle just a fraction. "And you're not setting foot on my land." The second man, Silas, dismounted. He was shorter, stockier, and had an air of brutal violence about him. He didn't speak. He just watched, his dead eyes fixed on Ezekiel. "Mr. Boone," Morel said with a sigh, as if dealing with a difficult child, "you're making a grave mistake. We represent powerful interests. You are one man. What do you think you can possibly do?" From the doorway behind Ezekiel, Clara's voice rang out, clear and stronger than she'd ever thought possible. "I am not your property!" she shouted, stepping out onto the porch to stand beside Ezekiel. Morel's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed into a venomous glare. "So, the little mouse has found its roar. It doesn't matter. You will come with us, willingly or not." Silas took a step toward the gate, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. "I'd think twice about that," Ezekiel warned, the click of him cocking the rifle echoing loud in the twilight. Morel held up a hand, stopping Silas. He smiled, a cold, terrifying smile. "Very well. Have it your way. But know this, Mr. Boone. This isn't over. We will have what we came for. The law is on our side. We'll be back. And when we return, we won't be so polite." He turned, mounted his horse, and with one last hateful look at Clara, he and Silas rode off into the growing darkness. They were gone. For now. Clara was shaking, but she stood her ground. Ezekiel put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "They'll be back," she whispered. "I know," he said, "and we'll be ready." But as they stood there, watching the darkness swallow the riders, a terrifying thought occurred to Ezekiel. Morel had mentioned the law. What if he was right? What if he came back not with just his hired muscle, but with the sheriff and a warrant? How could one man, no matter how determined, stand against the law itself? The fortress he had built around them suddenly felt very fragile, like it could all be washed away in the coming storm. The night was long and sleepless. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, sounded like the approach of hoofbeats. Ezekiel sat in a chair by the front window, the rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness. Clara sat by the hearth, the fire casting flickering shadows on her pale, determined face. They didn't talk. There was nothing left to say. They were in the eye of the hurricane, waiting for the other side to hit. It came with the morning sun, a cloud of dust on the horizon, resolving into 4 riders. Ezekiel's heart dropped. It wasn't just 2 this time. He could see Morel and Silas, and with them were 2 other men, one wearing the unmistakable glint of a sheriff's badge. "They brought the law," Clara breathed from behind him, her voice filled with dread. "Stay inside," Ezekiel ordered, his voice grim. "No matter what happens, do not come out." He stepped onto the porch, his face a mask of grim resolve, the rifle held firmly at his side. He would not let them see his fear. The 4 riders stopped at the gate. Sheriff Miller, a man with a weathered face and a reputation for being thorough, dismounted and walked toward the porch. Morel and Silas stayed on their horses, watching with smug satisfaction. "Ezekiel," the sheriff said, his tone professional but wary. "Got a complaint here. This gentleman, Mr. Morel, claims you're holding his property." "The only thing I'm holding is my ground, Sheriff," Ezekiel replied, his voice even, "and this is my property." "He has a bill of sale for a girl named Clara," Miller said, pulling a document from his pocket. "Signed by her stepfather. Seems legal enough." "That paper was signed under duress," Ezekiel shot back. "And it's a contract for a human being. That ain't legal, and you know it." Morel chimed in from the gate. "She is an indentured servant, Sheriff, fleeing a lawful contract. Mr. Boone is harboring a fugitive." Sheriff Miller looked uncomfortable. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man who had known Ezekiel's father. He knew the Boones were not troublemakers. "I need to see the girl, Ezekiel," Miller said. "I need to ask her myself if she's here of her own free will." "No," Ezekiel said flatly. Miller's eyes hardened. "Son, don't make me deputize these men and come in there by force. You are obstructing a lawful investigation. Now, let me talk to the girl." Ezekiel was trapped. If he refused, he'd be an outlaw. If he complied, he risked losing Clara. He was caught between his promise and the law. And then something happened that no one expected. The front door opened, and Clara stepped out. She wasn't crying. She wasn't hiding. She walked to the edge of the porch and stood beside Ezekiel, her head held high. She looked directly at Sheriff Miller. "My name is Clara Estrella," she said, her voice clear and ringing with a truth that was impossible to deny. "I am not property. I came here seeking protection from these men." She pointed a trembling but steady finger at Morel and Silas. "That man, Carlos Morel, is not my master. He is my kidnapper. He and his partner are slave traders." A stunned silence fell over the yard. Morel's face contorted with rage. "She's lying, Sheriff," he sputtered. "The girl is hysterical." "Am I?" Clara shot back. "Then ask him about the brand, the one they put on their property so it can't get lost." Sheriff Miller's eyes snapped toward Morel. "What is she talking about? A brand?" Morel paled slightly. "This is absurd. She's delusional." But Clara wasn't finished. She turned her piercing gaze on Silas, the brutal enforcer who had haunted her nightmares. "And you," she said, her voice dropping to an icy whisper. "Ask him about my sister. Ask him about Anna. Ask him where he buried her." Silas, the man of violence, the man who never spoke, actually flinched. His dead eyes flickered with something that looked almost like fear. Sheriff Miller looked from Clara's fierce, desperate face to the panicked expressions on Morel and Silas. The legal document in his hand suddenly felt like a lie. He was a good lawman, but he was a better judge of character. And he knew, in his gut, who was telling the truth. He turned to Morel. "A brand, you say?" he asked, his voice now dangerously low. "I think you and I need to take a ride back to town. We have a lot more to talk about." "This is an outrage," Morel blustered. "I have powerful friends." "And I have a jail cell with your name on it," Miller retorted. He gestured to his deputy. "Cuff them." As the deputy moved forward, Silas made his move. He wasn't going to jail. With a guttural roar, he drew his pistol and fired. Not at the sheriff, but at Clara. Ezekiel reacted instantly. He shoved Clara to the floor of the porch and brought his own rifle up, firing in a single, fluid motion. The crack of the two guns was almost simultaneous. Silas staggered back, a look of shock on his face, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He collapsed in the dust, his pistol falling from his lifeless hand. Morel screamed, a high-pitched, terrified sound. He tried to wheel his horse around to flee, but the deputy was on him, dragging him to the ground. It was over in seconds. Silence descended once more, broken only by the sound of Morel sobbing in the dirt. Ezekiel stood on the porch, the rifle smoking in his hands, his heart pounding. He looked down at Clara, who was staring, wide-eyed, at the scene before them. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with adrenaline. She shook her head, slowly getting to her feet. She looked from the body of Silas to the weeping figure of Morel, and then to Ezekiel. She saw the man who had bought her for $5, the man who had given her a home, the man who had just saved her life. Sheriff Miller walked over, his face grim but respectful. "You saved my deputy's life, Ezekiel, and hers. That was a clean shot. Self-defense." He looked at Clara with a new understanding. "Miss Estrella, I am deeply sorry for what you've endured. I give you my word, Morel will answer for every one of his crimes, and we will launch a full investigation into this network of his." He hauled the pathetic, blubbering Morel to his feet and led him away. Ezekiel and Clara were left alone, standing on the porch of the house that had become their fortress, and now their sanctuary. The battle was over. The demons had been vanquished. Clara turned to Ezekiel, her eyes filled with a universe of emotions he couldn't begin to name. Gratitude, relief, awe, and something else, something deeper. "You saved me," she whispered. "We saved each other," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. The sun was high in the sky now, burning away the last of the shadows. The long nightmare was finally over. In the quiet that followed the storm, a new life was beginning. A life built not on running or hiding, but on the unshakable foundation of courage and trust. A life they would build together. And as Ezekiel looked at the woman beside him, he knew that the quiet, solitary rancher was gone forever. He had found something he never knew he was looking for. He had found his reason to stay. If you were moved by Ezekiel and Clara's fight for freedom and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Ring the notification bell, because you won't want to miss the next story of survival against all odds.